Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense. All right, everyone. It is the end of the year. It's It's 2021, December 2021.
Yes, happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays. It is our last episode of the year. And Rap, what a year it has been.
It was a great year. We talked to some amazing people, brought up some great topics and information. It was really something.
So I want to start, with one of my favorite months, February, right?
Why is it your favorite month, Billy?
Okay, you tell me why it's my favorite month.
I'm going to guess because that's your birthday
Which
month.
is a national holiday. But
should be.
A more important national holiday is Black History Month. And so in February, we had some amazing guests. We started off the year with Charlamagne the God and Tiffany Williams Roberts from the Southern Center for Human Rights here in Atlanta, Georgia, talking about public defenders. Who are they? What do they do? And what do they need?
Yeah, let's listen to some of that interview.
You might need to school me on this because in my mind, public defenders aren't the people that you call when you facing like some real serious charges. Like, it's almost like, I grew up sadly, I did have a bunch of charges: assault and battery with intent to kill, pointing and presenting a firearm, distribution of cocaine, distribution of marijuana. There was never a time where somebody was like, yo, get you a public defender. My dad was like, you got to get a lawyer. You got to go get the top lawyer in our little small town. Like nobody, it's like being with a public defender was almost considered like, oh, you want to go to jail. Right? You know what I mean? So y'all would have to school me on the cases that public defenders have won that are so-called big cases. The times where people were facing like real jail time and public defenders got them off. I think those stories need to be told more often, because I just think it's a narrative that public defenders are for people who can't afford actual legal representation, as opposed to, no, public defenders are legal representation.
If you will.
I think offices need to be in the community. I know it's sort of like a sticky situation for some of my peers who say, how can I be in court 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day, and then you want me to go table on a Saturday, right? But I think that there has to be some visibility for the humans that work in public defender's office in those communities. I think, of course, Gideon's Army and other documentaries and public appearances by leaders or national leaders on this, like you all, it's important. But for example, every public defender's office has supervisors who don't litigate. Every public defender's office have other staff who are not stuck in court all day. And I think it's important to look at places like Knoxville, to look at places like Harlem, where folks are in community building and not.
So I absolutely loved that interview. What a way to kick off the year. A couple things I really love. First of all, Charlamagne the God. I mean, how honored I was to be able to have him as a guest. And what I thought was really interesting about what Charlamagne talked about was that he never thought of public defenders as part of the solution. As someone who came from a community impacted by our criminal legal system, he saw public defenders as part of the problem. And it really made me realize that if we are not out educating the communities that public defenders serve about the value of public defenders, it is easy to see public defenders as part of the problem.
Yeah, and some of the, one of the thing about Charlamagne the God, I understood exactly what he was talking about, because growing up in very humble beginnings, my neighborhood was the neighborhood that was constantly policed, right? My neighborhood, a lot of my friends, a lot of my family members went to jail, were incarcerated simply just by hanging out on the street block, just hanging out on the porch sometimes. And so when he said, he thought, public defenders, they were just trying to lock people up the same way.
Right.
I totally understood where he's coming from. And so it was interesting. What I loved about that episode is he also talked about that we, on that very call, were educating him about the system, right? His dad told him, you better go and get a private lawyer when he got in trouble. So, I just want to shout out Charlamagne the God, because that was a great way to open up 2021. And he's just been an awesome, awesome human being and really trying to fight for the rights of people in the system.
Yeah, and I really thought it was a reminder of just how important the work we're doing at Gideon's Promise is to try to make sure everyone, people like Charlamagne, who has a huge voice, understands the importance of public defenders. And that's why I thought Tiffany Williams Roberts was such a great compliment to Charlamagne in that interview, because she's been a public defender. Mm-hmm. She is a community organizer, and she had some really great insight into how public defenders can do a better job of making sure communities they serve appreciate them and see them as allies.
Yeah, I mean, what I loved she said was, I think offices need to be in the community. It's sort of a sticky situation. And I think going back to community, right? If where my community, where I grew up, where many people like me, if we really understood that public defenders were our allies, right? Maybe our interactions would have been different in the past, especially in the 90s when this mass incarceration boom started to happen. But shout out to Tiffany. She's done a lot of community organizing here in Georgia. She's an awesome lawyer at the Southern Center for Human Rights. And so I was so pleased that we were able to get the two of them in that interview.
And she really reminds us that public defenders have to understand their role beyond the courtroom.
And talk about beyond the courtroom and into the classroom, our March episode, The Pipeline to Social Justice, from the classroom to the courtroom. We opened up or ended Women's History Month, which is another favorite month of mine, because it celebrates the very, very great women, current and in the past, doing some awesome work. And so Dr. Cynthia Neal Spence, the professor at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Spelman College is an all-women's institution and a historically Black college and university, which we say up and everywhere is an HBCU, and many of the staff here at Gideon's Promise are alum of HBCUs. And so
including our producer Ebony, who's in the background waving her hands.
So let me give her school out, Hampton, right? Even though this is about Spelman, I have to give Hampton a shout out. So we asked her a question about, what do you say about public defenders and the advocates fighting for women who are facing incarceration? So let's hear what Dr. Spence had to say.
Fighting for them. First of all, we've got to look at the whole person. We've got to look, because that woman represents a family in most cases. That woman represents other relationships. And so we've got to look at that. We also have got to keep our foot to the ground as public defenders. You all do this. You defend people, but you also challenge the criminal justice system. And that part of your work is so important, and continue to publicize this fact that there's a disproportionate number of women of color being arrested. There's a disproportionate number of Black girls, being suspended from schools and sent to detention facilities. And so in addition to being there to defend them, to help them understand the processing of the criminal justice system, it's important to continue to push the criminal justice system to be a more fair and equitable distributor of justice.
So, what I really loved about that interview with Dr. Spence, I love so much about that interview, but I loved when she talked about how important it is for public defenders to not only defend women, right, the largest growing population in our criminal processing system, but also how important it is for public defenders to see their role as changing a criminal justice narrative, pushing the criminal justice system to be more fair, more equitable. And I really think what she talked about was that public defenders have to be the conscience of a system that, quite frankly, has lost its way. It was a really powerful conversation.
And I think another thing that I took out of that, which she made the connection, and also why, as an alum of Spelman, why she came back to Spelman to teach young women, is what she saw in the education system, the public school system, with a number of Black girls getting in trouble, in school suspension, out of school suspension, and things like that, which were leading them into the juvenile system. And so there's a connection, right? If we are not careful, and unfortunately some of our school systems may fail our children, we have to pay attention to the criminal legal system and make sure they have great advocates. That was a great episode, and I love sharing the stage. I was honored. I think that was my second or third time sharing the stage with Dr. Spence, so it was a great time.
It was great. And I have to say, as an organization that is led by Black women have played such an important role in this fight for criminal justice and equal justice. I'm grateful to Dr. Spence for partnering with us and for sort of her commitment to developing a pipeline for more Black women to join this fight, to join us as public defenders, to join us in this fight for racial and economic justice.
So yeah, and this takes us right into the month of April. In April, we focused on the system and people in the system and people returning back to society. It was called Breaking Through the System, the Path to Healing. And this was a special episode for you, Rap. We had Octavius Clark on this show, who you hadn't spoke to in over 25 years. Can you tell our audience about Octavius?
Yeah, no, this was an incredibly impactful podcast for me. It was really meaningful because Octavius is someone who I met as a 15-year-old. He was charged as an adult with a homicide when he was 15. And I think every public defender has some experience where they sort of realize, man, I knew this system was unjust. I never really appreciated just how unjust it was. I never really appreciated how little we care about the human beings who are processed. And Octavius's case was one of those cases for me. He was 15, involved in a terrible accident where a young woman died. He was charged, convicted, and his life was thrown away. He was given a sentence of 7 years to life at a time when D.C. was ending parole. I really thought he'd never see the streets again. I stayed in touch with his mother for a while, but then I moved to Georgia and lost touch, and I always wondered what happened to Octavius. And then recently he connected with me through social media, and I learned that he had been paroled and he was open to being a guest on our podcast. That podcast was the first time I spoke to him since he was 15 years old.
Wow. And Octavius shared some thoughts with us about how he survived prison and how he kept his faith, and that kept him going. Let's listen to some words from Octavius.
Yes, just, stand in prayer, whatever you believe in, just stay in prayer, stay to yourself, be focused, and understand that it's hard in there. So when you come home, what do you want out of life? Do you want to repeat the same lifestyle, or do you want to make a difference? Do you want to, clean your name up? It's going to be based on the individual. You got to have discipline, and we all went through something in life. We kind of can't let our past hinder us because the society is already going to do that for us, So we can't put the burdens on ourselves any longer. We just got to come out and do what we got to do and take the hits when they come, because they wanted to keep me on parole. I'm supposed to have been on for life.
That I was going to say young man, but he's a grown man now, right? It was just, he's so compelling. And, I was just in awe, and I was just so happy, Rap, that you were able to talk to him and you actually saw him, because we have to be on Zoom. But like you said earlier, many public defenders really never get a chance to see what happened to their clients once their cases are resolved. So I'm so glad. And the fact, over 25 years ago, you made such an impact on someone that he was just so willing to immediately come and share his story.
Well, and I loved his story. To me was really a story of hope, because he talked about how society has constructed a narrative that says once you've been incarcerated, your life is less valuable. You have less worth. And he really talked about how he overcame that stigma to really sort of, he's married, He's got a successful career,
Yep.
and it's really despite that societal stigma, not because society has ever helped him get back on his feet,
Right.
but because he overcame what so many people who are impacted by the criminal legal system are struggling with.
But it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be so hard for people, right? So May was, let's get into it. Your mental health matters. Just for everyone and listeners, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we had some dynamic women on this show. That we had Dr. Alfie Breland Noble, who we call her lovingly
wonderful.
called Dr. Alfie, who focuses on Black mental health and people of color. Shanti Das, former
Shanti.
music executive. Shanti Das, who's become a great friend and founded her own nonprofit, Silence the Shame, which is based here in Atlanta, after dealing with a personal matter in her family and with herself, and said, we need to erase the stigma that mental health doesn't exist in the Black community. We really need to silence the shame.
Yes.
And Zanelli Gubani,
Yes.
who is an alum of Gideon's Promise. She serves as a faculty member of Gideon's Promise, and we loved her so much we hired her as a staff person this year in the summer to really work with our new public defenders. But she took the position and she talked to discuss mental health as a public defender and the challenges that public defenders face. Let's hear a little bit from that episode.
So I really feel like that's a personal question, but, and I joke, but I say that sincerely because honestly, I think the response to that is a story that probably you nor Illy have ever heard, right? Early on in my career, I used to tell public defenders all the time, check your burnout level. I used to try to encourage them in the fight. And one of the tools or strategies that I would give would be, listen, every now and then, I need you to review your entire active caseload. And when you do that, as long as you can put a face with every name on your caseload, you might be doing okay, right? You at least know that you are checked into the fact that you have human beings that you're responsible for. What I didn't plan for in that conversation, and the part that I think I have learned and grown to understand over time, is that eventually you will recognize those faces, and then you'll start recognizing the families behind those faces, and then you'll memorize the phone calls of those families of those faces. And what happens is, or at least what happened to me, was that started to be very heavy. That became very triggering for me. And by and large, right, I was doing client-centered representation. I was serving my people, but my telephone would ring and I would recognize the number and I would let it ring once or twice because I knew that that was going to be a mother crying on the other line. And I had to take a couple of breaths and get myself together before I could give her space to have whatever conversation she needed to have with me in that moment. And it also would manifest in other random ways. I would walk into hospitals for one reason or another and immediately have a physical reaction to the smell, because hospitals often smell like jails. It's a stench, it's a sterilizing stench that they use to clean those spaces. And it just reminds me of like sickness and being surrounded by sickness and feeling, the overwhelming pressure to try to help people in ways that I can't always touch them. And so that eventually, my leg is shaking. In any event, that eventually did started to have an effect on my physical health, right?
Communities, what's also a deeply ingrained is these experiences, and you keep hitting these racial traumas, but nobody names it racial trauma. That's just life. That's just what it means to be Black or Latinx or Asian or whatever your ethnic background happens to be. It's just a part. And so I feel like what's really important is for us to recognize that there's socioeconomic diversity in our communities. There are many Black communities that are severely underserved. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of socioeconomic trauma and community violence and those other things. But on top of that, what feels really important to me is to always talk about the fullness of the Black experience. And the fullness of it is, even when you're corporate, there's trauma. Even when you got money, you still are hitting walls and experiencing these negative things, and it doesn't protect you. So for me, it's really about naming and then centering who we are as racial beings as a part of our healing process. That is deeply important to me. And I feel like that's part of what is lacking in the research and clinical work that my colleagues do. They don't want to talk about it. And so I feel like that's part of our mission with my nonprofit and me as an individual, is to put the research and the knowledge out there so that people can see themselves. My thing is always, we want to feel seen, valued, and heard. And that's what we try to do. And that's what's critical, I think, to Black and brown folks' mental health.
First and foremost, we are doing it, right? We're normalizing this conversation through podcasts like this. But I really think it starts like in your own home, right? Just the basic conversation that you have around the dinner table. It's got to be red table talk in your own home, not just on social media. It's got to be at the crib, with, mama and big mama and them and your cousin Jimmy and Auntie Jane and, everybody. We've got to especially get our older generation to be okay with talking to it. That's why, like at Silence the Shame, we've been going back into communities, into churches, and really starting those conversations, right? Meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, so a couple things really stuck with me from that episode. One was Shanti's conversation about the importance of normalizing mental health, that mental health is far more prevalent than we realize. Many people who we love and know well suffer from it, and they do so in silence. And she reminds us that we have to normalize that conversation so that people are comfortable talking about mental health issues. Otherwise, we'll never address it. And then the second thing that really stuck out to me was Zanelli's conversation about the struggles she's had as a public defender, which will be familiar to all public defenders, and how in our own profession, we sometimes have this idea that we have to be super strong, superhuman, able to overcome everything. We can't cry, we can't feel, we can't be heartbroken or stressed, and that is burning out public defenders. It's driving public defenders out of the profession. And she talked about how being on an airplane, they say you have to put your oxygen mask on before helping others. She says, as a public defender, I came to realize I need to have my oxygen mask on before helping others. And I love that she said, Gideon's promise has always been my oxygen mask. It really made me feel great about the work we've been doing.
And one of the other things that Zanelli and Dr. Alfie talked about, and Zanelli brought it up, was vicarious trauma. And I think it's something our listeners should know, that in any service-driven organization or service-driven profession, whether you're a social worker, a teacher, a firefighter, a public defender, you hear the stories of people who've had trauma, and you take that trauma in, right? And you have no idea, after story, person in person, family members, you start to absorb that trauma, and it starts to take its toll on you. So recognizing that sometimes you get down not because of your personal situation, but because you're absorbing and hearing the stories of others, which you should, because you have such a strong level of empathy that it takes its toll on you because you feel for that person. And we work a lot at Gideon's Promise with our public defenders about being empathetic lawyers, but then how to transfer that, that feeling into zealous advocacy.
And I've got to say, I mean, we work hard to recruit public defenders who are incredibly passionate, incredibly spirited, and that vicarious trauma will really beat the spirit out of you and shape you into a public defender you never wanted to become. That point that Zanelli made was so critical, and it's fundamental to the work we do at Gideon's Promise.
So I once again, I think talking about mental health in Black and brown communities is a rising topic in the last 2 years, especially as we are still in the middle of a global pandemic. So I think it's very important that we address these. And I thank the women for sharing their personal stories. I thank the women for giving some things out of their toolbox to help our listeners. And so that takes us into June.
Love June. Favorite month.
And why is it your favorite month, Rap?
It's my birthday.
It's your birthday. It's your birthday. All right. So June is not only Rap's birthday month, but it is also a month where we talked about emancipation. We were celebrating Juneteenth, which became a national holiday this year. And so we were very, very excited to talk about what emancipation really means. And Alejo Rodriguez was our guest, and that gentleman really knows what emancipation means. And so let's listen to Alejo. Alejo, coincidentally, not coincidentally, but Alejo is with Zealous, which is a
great organization,
great nonprofit organization that works in advocacy and really highlighting, spotlighting injustices that are happening around the country, and then enforcing the system to really provide services through their marketing, through their communication, through their PR.
So Zealous is an amazing organization that partners with public defenders to really think about how public defenders can help message what they see, what they bear witness to every day in the criminal legal system. And Alejo's no stranger to the criminal legal system. Alejo spent over 30 years incarcerated in Attica Correctional Facility. And what I thought was so powerful about talking to Alejo was the fact that Alejo was incarcerated in Attica, Illy, at the same time that your father was incarcerated in Attica.
Yeah, Alejo was. And the interesting fact about that is that they never met each other. They did not know each other. And, I believe in fate, and all things happen for a reason, and people come into your lives at a certain time, at a certain moment, and it's just the right time. And Alejo came into mine. So they were there. They didn't know each other. He heard the story of my father's story and what happened to our family, and we bonded instantly. And we were so excited to have him that we invited him to join the board of directors for Gideon's Promise.
Yeah, he's amazing. And you'll let's listen to a little bit of that conversation.
Stepping out of our comfort zone, right? Maybe even like some individuals may not. Where would I go? How can I learn? What would I? Maybe go to a school board meeting, community school board meeting in a Black neighborhood. Maybe go to a community board, listen to what the issues are, right? And people would be surprised that when they start talking, even though they're Black people, a lot of them are struggling with poverty issues or other issues, that when you consider not the people saying, but the issues that are being, there's no race to it. Like, we all struggle with drug issues, with crime in our neighborhood. Like, we all deal with these things, right? And so, that's that. And systemically, you're talking about it in a broader perspective. It really is a matter of, for government to put their money where their mouth is.
So Alejo gives really great advice for listeners who are interested in learning more about the Black experience, the experience in Black communities, and and what Juneteenth really means to us, why it was so important to have this become a national holiday in our country, in the United States, acknowledge the significant role that Black people in this country play. Like, they're the backbone of building this country. And so you can put what you learn in day-to-day practice. You could really think about how do you interact with people. And emancipation is not just releasing someone from prison. It's important, but also to continuously support people once they are out, to make sure that you listen to them and hear their voice. You don't have to speak for them, right? But to help amplify those voices is emancipation, in one word, is amplifying.
And Alejo asked the question, what does freedom mean? And he points out that there are people in our country that take freedom for granted. And then there are other people who can't afford to take freedom for granted. And he gives some great advice to those who are able to take it for granted, who are privileged enough to take it for granted, that you have to get out there and learn the history, learn the stories of people who are still fighting for freedom. And it's really such a relevant conversation. I think about the battle today simply to teach history in our schools,
oh, yes.
right? To simply teach American children about our history, about not just history of white people in America, but of Black people, of brown people. And there is a fight. And I think what Alejo reminds us is, if we're not teaching our history in schools, none of us can really be free, because we don't really understand what freedom means.
Yeah. And then, speaking of freedom, Alejo was the first part of our guests. In our second part, this is a two-part series, we talked about in July, what does independence look like in 2021? So although most of the country were having hot dogs and barbecuing out, independence looked very different from the perspective of almost, it's going to be a majority minority pretty soon, of people impacted by the system. And we focused on immigration. We asked, what does independence really mean today? As we were honoring the birth of the country, we also had to focus on the people who came into this country. And we had guests, Jessica Stern, who's an immigration lawyer in Atlanta, Georgia, and Violetta Chapin, who is a professor of law at UC Boulder in Colorado. These women are dynamic.
And I got to say, before we hear what they had to say, I want to point out that Jessica Stern is an alumni of Gideon's Promise, a member of the class of 2009.
Yep.
And Violetta was a colleague of mine in D.C. and now one of our faculty members here at Gideon's Promise. So they're both near and dear to us here at Gideon's Promise. Let's listen to them.
Let's listen to them.
Sure. Even just in having conversations, right? Because there's a lot that legal advocates can do, but on a regular basis, we can ask ourselves, how do I or the other people around me address the conversation? Are we perpetuating stereotypes? Are we making assumptions instead of asking questions to expand our understanding? Have I considered myself in this person's shoes? Really what it took to make that exceptional journey and sacrifice to be here in the US and leave everything behind. Really, have we considered how exceptional a person must truly be to make that happen? Because I want more of that exceptionalism in my country. There's a real chance just from a conversational standpoint, but of course, legislation is what's going to make a difference here. And it's got to be a motivation for lawmakers and not to be such a controversial issue.
Recommendation that I was going to share. There's a book called Undocumented Americans by Carla Villavicencio, which is excellent. She used to be a DACA recipient. She has now gained status through another way. Her parents are still undocumented. And she's a brilliant writer, and she conveys more than anything, I think, is outrage when you read what she writes about the struggles that her parents have gone through. So specifically that book, I think, just to learn about how immigrants in America feel right now about the American dream. In terms of what people can do to learn more, I mean, there's certainly, there are practice advisories online about criminal and immigration related legal matters. I think if people are not lawyers and not going to be representing people and just want to get some more information about the ways that they can be allies, I think, to immigrants, I think there are a lot of immigrant advocacy organizations that are constantly seeking volunteers for people to come and help. And we've got an organization that just goes and visits immigrants at the detention facility and meets with people who don't have visitors, right? That's a beautiful way for people to get involved and to become knowledgeable by talking with other people that are engaged. And I'd say finally, from my perspective, I would be, if you're a US citizen and you can vote, then you need to be aware of where candidates stand when it comes to immigration related issues.
So that conversation, I think, really reminds me that our American story is really a story of immigrants, that the immigrant story is central to the American story, that immigrants throughout our history have helped build the nation that we now know. I think about that because my parents are first generation Americans. Their parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They were the first in my bloodline to go to college and get advanced degrees. But the face of immigration has changed. And I think what Violetta and Jessica remind us is that now that the face has been of immigrants coming from Central America, Mexico, often not European immigrants, we've turned against immigrants. We no longer see immigrants as critical to our nation. We see them as a menace. And as a result, we are treating people that we need to help us continue to build this country as though their lives are not valuable.
Yeah, and so stereotypes are true because we also need to think about there's so many people. We have people who come from West African countries, the Caribbean, and everyone is impacted. But I don't want to lose this one piece, is that although we have the immigrant population come into history, we cannot forget the indigenous people that were here first.
Yes.
Right? And so and how they've been treated. And we have a history in this country to otherize people. And so it was such a compelling episode because it really made you think about the stereotypes. It really made you think about the narratives that society's putting on place, which were narratives that didn't exist 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So I thank them. We learned a lot about the intersection of immigration law and criminal criminal defense. I think a lot of people didn't know that a lot of times our immigrant people come into the court because they've been charged with a criminal offense and risk deportation. And so I appreciate Jessica and Violetta sharing some insight of what happens in the immigration courts.
And that takes us to August, where we had another wonderful episode titled The Fight for Our Legal Rights. And we had two amazing guests, Molly Gill, who's the Vice President of Policy with Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and Sagan Soto-Stanton, who is an advocate for people who are incarcerated and people returning home. She has her husband is incarcerated. She is just a really powerful activist and advocate, and the two of them together made for quite an interview. Let's listen to that.
I do think the most important thing you can do is to meet with your lawmakers and share your story. You know, Sajan was talking about how much power you can hear in her voice, how much power it gives her to share her husband's story, to share Terrence's story. And I see this all the time with the impacted people we work with. Nothing is more empowering than sharing your story. And lawmakers need to hear these stories. I can go in and spout data and facts and statistics until I'm blue in the face at these lawmakers. But what moves them to action are constituents who live in their districts, right, who can't pay their water bill because they are trying to afford a visit to go see their loved one in prison after they've been there a year. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, those personal stories matter so much. I think plugging in and getting connected to your lawmakers matters so much.
To those incarcerated, I would say educate yourself as much as possible. Only through education will you begin to reverse your thoughts and shun criminal activity. When your record shows that you are not incorrigible, your chances of the prison doors opening up again for you are higher when those laws are changed. Right. And so for those that are fighting for their incarcerated family members, to have faith. Our faith determines our capacity of patience. It takes faith, hard work, perseverance to attain freedom, justice, and equality. And just always remember, we're always in this together.
And you know, it was interesting. I got a couple of phone calls and emails after that. People listened to that episode about thanking us for having Sagan on the show to talk about the impact this criminal legal system has on families, especially she was a mom. She is a mom of small children. Her husband has spent significant time in the system. He has health problems, and she's been advocating for years to get him some support. And so just learning as, like, it's not just the person who's in the system that is severely impacted. It's the loved ones. It's the people that love them the most on the outside, trying to get access to them and access for them.
So it's so important. And I think what Molly really brought to the conversation was she helped us understand just how draconian and backward our policies are when it comes to criminal justice, mandatory minimums that are destroying people, that are destroying families for years. And while FAM has done a really good job of putting a human face on the people who are directly impacted, who are incarcerated, I think as you said, what Sagan really brought was a reminder that it's not just them, it is the families, it is the loved ones, it is the children. And Illy, I know that's something that you know all too well, given that your father was incarcerated when you were 5, and you certainly appreciate the impact that had on your entire family.
I do, and we're still dealing with that struggle even today, the long-term effects of that. September. Vote for Justice. So we did this episode a little early because we were trying to make sure we did that last push for people to register to vote in, I guess these are called the midterm elections, right? It's not a big presidential or gubernatorial election. It wasn't that year. But the voter rights and voting for equality, a lot of the things that are happening, we talked about policy on the previous show, right, are happening because there are things on the ballot that we should pay attention to that impact criminal justice in the very communities that our public defenders serve. So our guest that episode was Derwin Bunton. The chief defender of the Orleans public defender in Louisiana.
Yeah, and the reason why we really wanted to bring Derwin into this conversation is because we wanted to highlight the role that public defenders can play in working with communities, both to rally people to get out to vote, but also to help shape legislation that we need communities to go out and vote for. And so let's listen to what Derwin had to say.
All right. Well, the best thing you can do to support public defenders is, we need so many things. But the best thing you can do is volunteer and contribute. And that is to say, do it so that you can learn a little bit about the communities who are at risk and vulnerable in our system. So providing yourself as a volunteer in the myriad ways that public defenders need help.
You know, it's so interesting. I love talking to Derwin. Derwin's office has been a Gideon's Promise Public Defender Partner Office for now 15 years. We're coming up on 2022 for 15 years. And coincidentally, we talk about communities working, public defenders working in allyship with communities. I coincidentally was in New Orleans on vacation, right? And Derwin's office and the communities were running a second line. They do it every year, and there was legislation on the table to was it in unanimous juries? Is it right?
I think that was the unanimous jury push.
Yeah,
yes.
unanimous jury special, which was so great because I got to go down the second line. We marched and marched, and I love protesting, so marching for hours in the heat, and we walked past the jail, right, which is right next to this old courthouse right down the road. And you can see all of the people who are sitting in the jail. And the thing that touched me and really made me cry was seeing the juvenile ward. We saw kids cheering because there's a band playing in a second. If anybody's been to New Orleans and been participating in the second line, but it was the one time like they got a little bit of joy just sitting to say there are people on the outside really advocating for them and rallying for changes. And so I just give a shout out to the community in New Orleans and the Orleans Public Defender Office and all the attorneys there.
Yeah, that fight to end non-unanimous juries was really an important fight. I mean, for our listeners who don't know, non-unanimous juries really have been a relic of Jim Crow, where when the Constitution was interpreted to allow Black people to serve on juries. Some jurisdictions then developed non-unanimous juries so that voice could be drowned out. And Louisiana was one of 2 jurisdictions that continued to have non-unanimous juries. Derwin's office really led the charge to pass legislation to do away with non-unanimous juries. And the other thing that I just wanted to point out about that episode was Derwin was supposed to be joined by a dear friend of ours, Norris Henderson,
right,
who's the founder of VOTE, Voices of the Exonerated. And VOTE really led the effort to end felony disenfranchisement. And Derwin talked about how his office played a supporting role, how they supported the community in that fight to make sure that people with records could still go to the polls and vote.
And that's important. That's so important. November, we use that month to honor the America's veterans. And so it was no rookies, just vets. veterans in the criminal legal system. There's a growing population of people who serve this country, people who have retired from the military or have been honorably discharged, relieved of their duty, and they're showing up in criminal court. And we had guest Nick Place, who is a veteran himself and is now a public defender in Orleans Parish, and Michaela Himes, who practices in Veterans Court in Dallas, Texas. Let's hear what they had to talk about, what they see in the courts when they come across veterans who've been charged.
Nick, let's start with you.
I would I think, ask people to look at, the way that we kind of deify veterans in popular culture and on television and at sporting events and all this stuff. And then look at our actual treatment of veterans and how we use veterans when they're actually troops, right? When they're Marines and sailors, like what are we using them for? How are we spending our lives and money? And what is that accomplishing?
Well, I think that, as a society, we other people all the time. We like to other people. We've got our society, we've got our communities, and then we've got those other people that are in jail. And those are not the same people that are out in our community. And the fact is that people who are incarcerated are part of our community. They're going to be they came from our community. They're going to come back into our community, and they shouldn't be kind of ripped out of our community during the time that they're in jail. We need to wrap around them. We need to recognize that they need to be supported.
So Nick and Michaela, both Gideon's Promise alumni, it was just so great to talk to them about this topic of veterans. And I think what they both pointed out, I mean, Nick really made it clear, is that sort of in American life, we like to hold veterans up as heroic. But in reality, so many veterans are living without stable homes. They are struggling with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and rather than getting them help, we throw them into the criminal legal system, and public defenders like Michaela and Nick are there to try to help them get the services they need and get them out of the criminal legal system. And one thing Nick said that during that interview that was so powerful was he talked about how he joined the service and his colleagues were all coming from different walks of life, but that he recognized that he came from a supportive background and that he would return to a family that supported him, and that so many people he served with came from places where they didn't have the support, and they were returning to places where they had no support. And rather than giving them that support, we waited until they inevitably violated one of society's rules, and we threw them into the criminal legal system, where people like Michaela and Nick are there to try to help.
That I was going to say the same thing. You read my mind about that rap about they had to be charged with a crime first before they even received the social services that they needed prior to being charged with a crime. And so that was just so telling in Nick's jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction is different, but in his particular one in Orleans Parish, that is what's happening to vets. And, veterans are very special to me. My uncle Bobby Joe Walker just passed away recently, and he was a Vietnam vet and faced a lot of challenges after leaving the war. And he passed away over 70 years old, but I watched something that happened decades ago take its toll on him. So I just wanted to give respects to my aunt, Dr. Lee Walker, and the entire Walker family as I head to Texas to celebrate his life.
Yeah, no, Illy is actually jumping on a plane tomorrow, and so please, on behalf of the whole Gideon's Promise family, send our respects to your Aunt Lee. I have to say, what this episode really said to me was, if we can do this to vets, who isn't disposable? And as I think we recap this year, a common theme for all of these episodes are how easily it is to otherize people. We otherize people because they have mental health issues or substance abuse problems, because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity, right? Because they're veterans, whatever the reason is, otherizing people is the key to fueling such an unjust criminal legal system. And I think if I had any takeaway to wrap up the year, it's that the critical work of public defenders, the most critical work is that public defenders get close to those people who have been otherized. They learn those stories and they force us to see the human beings behind the stereotype, force us to treat them the way we'd want our loved ones treated. So I got to give mad love to public defenders.
Mad love. And I'll say that public defenders are keeping the promise of Gideon. They are keeping the promise every single day when they work late hours, when they're looking at motions and briefs, when they are out investigating, when they are just supporting one another. At the end of the day, the most important person in that courtroom is the client that they served. And so I appreciate public defenders continuously keeping the promise and keeping it alive. Yes. I have had a wonderful year working with you, Rap.
I feel the same, Illy.
And so I am so looking forward to next year, which is the start of our 15-year anniversary as an organization. I can't believe we made it this far. I'm so excited for our opening episode.
We started in our living room, sitting around the living room table, and now we have a whole organization that's 15 years old.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next year when we launch the big celebrations coming. But so for our listeners, it's been a great 2021 year. I hope you've learned a lot, heard some great things, and feel free to go back and check out our episodes, which are posted on our website at gideonspromise.org. True form or fashion, last statement of the year. This is Ilham Askia.
And this is Jonathan Rapping.
Wrapping it up.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.